Good evening once again, everybody. This is the third episode in our six-part series celebrating the history of Symphony Tacoma. The first episode and the second episode are both online. You can check them out on the Symphony's YouTube channel. The first one, Kim Davenport, local musician and historian, made us a very nice kind of historic video showing the attempts over about 130 years almost to establish classical music orchestras, other ensembles in the city of Tacoma. And then finally, of course, leading up to what we now call Symphony Tacoma. In the second episode, we interviewed Jan Safarian, wife of Ed Safarian, on a program we called the Ed Safarian years, those many years that Ed Safarian led what was then called Tacoma Symphony, from kind of an amateur town gown orchestra based at the University of Puget Sound, and through into the time when it really became established as a professional symphony orchestra. So those are both waiting for you, but tonight we have a real treat. We're going to take time out and talk about a seminal event that happened in the city of Tacoma and for Symphony Tacoma, and that was the restoration of the theater district. The long-standing desire of Tacoma citizens and audiences for a place where you could listen to and appreciate a beautiful hall, beautiful acoustics, a stage large enough to hold an entire symphony orchestra. And that, after many, many long and difficult years, actually, began to take place. So let's talk about theaters and take that moment before we go on and talk about the rest of the history of Symphony Tacoma. Let me introduce you to the marvelous people we're going to speak with this evening about this history and that project. So let's begin with Steph Farber. Steph is the co-owner and designer behind the handcrafted one-of-a-kind jewelry that you will find at LeRoy Jewelers down on Broadway. It's the oldest operating retail business in downtown Tacoma. It was started by his father in 1941. And because he's been around that business so long, Steph has observed as the downtown emptied of businesses and customers back in the 60s and 70s due to the opening of the Tacoma Mall. But he was also there in the late 70s when Tacoma decided to turn their down-the-block neighbor, the old Roxy Theater, back into a performing arts center. Steph joined the Pantages board in its second year of operation and stayed on for 22 years. He was board president of the new Broadway Center for the Performing Arts as the Pantages Center was transformed into, in fact, the theater district. Sitting next to him is his wife, but another key player in this development. Phyllis Harrison is a Tacoma native, like Steph, co-owner of the Art Stop and LeRoy Jewelers. And Phyllis, am I correct? Are you still the president of the Downtown Merchants Group?
Actually, the Downtown Merchants Group has been folded into the Downtown Tacoma Partnership. So no, I'm not.
Yay.
Yes, hooray.
Yeah.
It's actually a much more viable organization now. So.
All right. Well, after 20 years away, you returned to Tacoma and joined the staff of the then Broadway Center for the Performing Arts as a marketing assistant. And Phyllis was hired in part because of her background in folklore. She just completed a multi-year touring exhibition of maritime folklore from the Pacific Northwest, part of her doctoral work. And her work with diverse cultural communities fit neatly with the growing goal of the Tacoma Theater District Task Force to reach out to and involve diverse cultural communities in Tacoma. Next, let's bring on Margy McGroarty. Margy was came to I think it was 1983 and came to the Greater Tacoma Community Foundation, which has been absolutely central in virtually everything you've heard of in Tacoma in the last 40 years. But this was an organization that was founded by local boosters and it has just become huger, more and more professional over its many decades. And Margy was actually its president for 17 of those critical years until her retirement in 2004. And Margy, as part of just introducing you, I wanted to just read some of your words from 1983 when you helped really get this foundation going. You wrote, "A community foundation's mission is to enhance the quality of community life through the support of a broad range of services necessary to sustain the community: health, education, social welfare, public affairs, arts and culture, conservation, and environment. And as a neutral, nonpartisan agency, the Community Foundation may be a catalyst to convince disparate groups to work together toward a common objective. Thus, over the years, a community foundation becomes a collection of many stories. Each tells how people have contributed to their community's philanthropic history. And I thought that is a prescient statement, because that is exactly what has unfolded and what we're going to be talking about this evening. Next, let me introduce Lisa Ingraham. Lisa is a Tacoma native also, grew up playing violin in the Tacoma Youth Symphonies, and attended PLU. She has a background in vocal performance, theater, and dance. Currently, she's not only an active performer, but also an educator, teaching students in private studio as well as at Cascade Christian Schools. A member of the Symphony Tacoma's first violin section, she began playing with the orchestra in 1985 and is thus currently the second longest serving member of the orchestra. She's also played with the Tacoma Opera since 1986 and served as the opera's orchestra manager since 1992. Welcome, Lisa. And finally, Dr. Paul Cobbs, who I hope the entire town knows as the conductor of the Tacoma Youth Symphony for 25 years. But Paul Cobbs appears frequently with orchestras and ensembles in Europe, Asia, and the United States, including Vienna's Festival Chamber Orchestra, members of the Dresden Leipzig Orchestra, the Kamimura Wind Ensemble in Kagoshima, Japan, and the Seattle Symphony. His present positions include music director of the Everett Philharmonic Orchestra for the past 26 years, guest conductor with the Sussex Symphony Orchestra in Brighton, England, and music director for the Tacoma Youth Symphony Association, one of the largest in the United States. He's also just completed 7 years as director of orchestras at Central Washington University. So, a lot of high power on this panel, and I look forward to diving into this story with you. In order to get this going, I wanted to just show a few slides at the beginning so that our audience can catch up with our panelists in understanding what we're talking about here when we're talking about a theater district and theaters for live entertainment in Tacoma. So let's bring up the first slide. Down on Pacific Avenue, not the very first, but one of the very first theaters in the city of Tacoma was the Alpha Opera House, which has become infamous as the site of many of the mass meetings at which the citizens of Tacoma decided to drive the Chinese community out in 1885. But it was also the place where entertainers of all stripes got off the train, walked up Pacific Avenue, and performed for the town. Next slide. It was superseded within the decade, by around 1890, 1891, by this fabulous edifice, which was called the Tacoma Theater. And this is where the Tacoma School of the Arts now is, on Broadway, just across the street, west from the Pantages, right on that corner. And the Tacoma Theater was designed to be the finest live entertainment theater north of San Francisco, and indeed it was. And the people who performed here are a who's who. You know, Rachmaninoff performed here, John Philip Sousa performed here, Sarah Bernhardt performed here. Everybody who came through on the train performed at this theater. Next slide. This is, of course, the Pantages, which was built in 1918. And, you know, within about a month or two of the opening of this theater in January 1918, lo and behold, the Spanish flu erupted. And so they were going through some of the same issues that we're going through. But we can see the familiar building, but without the familiar, what we now think of as the familiar front portico and lobby. But you can see the Pantages sign there. And if you read closely, it says Vaudeville and Pictures. Next slide. Of course, up the hill, just opening about 8 months later, was the Rialto Theater, which of course is still there. And it was opened as a specialty movie house. You know, perhaps there was a live act here and there between movies, but it was really opened as a moving picture house and functioned that way for most of its career. Next slide. Here's a shot of a busy evening on Broadway with the Pantages and a streetcar unloading passengers who are about to go inside. Next slide. To see maybe something like this on the stage. Next slide. Here is the Rialto with what looks like 20s or 30s cars outside with people eagerly awaiting to go inside. Next slide. And some ladies perhaps about ready to go inside and see their favorite Hollywood stars on the silver screen. Next slide. The inside of the Rialto Theater, the way it used to be. Notice that the projection booth was on the main floor, and supposedly this made for particularly sharp, crisp images on the screen. Next slide. By the late 20s, Mr. Pantages had gone broke or sold out right before the crash. A different company bought it, called it the Orpheum, and tried to keep vaudeville and pictures going for a while. Next slide. But by 1932, I believe it was, live acts at this theater were done, and it was renamed the Roxy, and we can here see now it's all about movies. We see Clark Gable and Myrna Loy. Next slide. And Will Rogers. Next slide. Not all the entertainment was highbrow. I guess you could get whatever you wanted at the Roxy. Next slide. Here it is in the 60s. And notice if you look closely, you can see storefronts along there. There's something called the Pink Tulip and other shops along what we now think of as the lobby. And there's another building that is not there now that was there. Next slide. So by the late 70s, and we'll get much more details to how we got here, but finally restoration began, and sometime in the early 80s, probably this picture was taken, and we can see them beginning to build the portico, which becomes now the lobby. Next slide. An aerial view of the same thing. Notice there's a parking lot next to the building, right? We now think of that as the theater square. Next slide. Here's inside the portico. You can see the Pythian temple there, looking down the street almost to LeRoy Jewelers. Next slide. Just turning around, the old stairway, which got removed and replaced with another stairway. Next slide. All the seats ripped out, the theater stripped back down to basics and cleaned up and fixed up. Next slide. Here we are up in the balcony, same story. Next slide. Ooh boy, the projection booth, the ceiling, looking bad. Next slide. Plaster that had been painted green sometime in the 50s and was in need of a lot of repair. Next slide. The stage, once it was getting close to being finished, and now we can see all of that beautiful plaster work, which was somehow designed after a theater in Versailles, near Paris. And it's starting to look really pretty. Next slide. And then it starts looking like it did when I arrived in 1984. Lots of sort of creams and whites and really a very light kind of space. Next slide. Just another shot showing the stage and the curtain. Next slide. And there now we're seeing, of course, after the 2015 restoration, the next level, which was in some ways all about seismic safety issues, but also we got the chance to put an aisle down the middle. We made it a little more acoustically live inside by taking out some of the padded seat areas. And of course, all this gorgeous color, bringing it back to perhaps a sort of a Versailles original kind of look. Next slide. The Pantages in the early 90s got an upgrade in all kinds of ways. They literally built kind of a metal box around the box to make it seismically safe and then put it back together. And so this sort of beautiful white and yellows that we now enjoy. They also made the stage quite a bit bigger so that it really could hold a symphony orchestra. Next slide. And there is the Rialto as we see it as we enter today. Next slide. And that's the end of my slideshow. Okay, so now let me bring in some of the really major players who were there at the beginning of this whole process of what seemed to be perhaps kind of a dying downtown, and the question on everybody's mind, how do you save a dying downtown? And one answer was bring back live entertainment. So let's bring back Steph and Phyllis. And Steph, I want to start with you. And just tell us a little bit about what Broadway was like in the 60s and 70s, and the Roxy Theater as you remember it, and then the beginnings of these conversations about how to save downtown.
Well, Greg, thank you for the slideshow for one thing. Thank you for having us here, but thank you for the slideshow. All the theaters, the earlier theaters reminds us of a conversation we had with Murray Morgan, who one of his last works was working on theaters in Tacoma. Mm-hmm. But the quote that I just loved from him was that there was theater in Tacoma before they finished pulling the stumps out of Pacific Avenue. His point, of course, was that people in this area, maybe people everywhere, but certainly people in Tacoma, wanted their theaters. They wanted entertainment. And growing up, I know that the Roxy Theater, the Blue Mouse Theater, the Cameo, the Rialto, there were at least a half dozen movie theaters in the downtown during that time. And downtown Tacoma in the 40s, certainly in the 50s, in the 60s, was the place you went shopping. It was the place where you saw your doctor. It was the place you went to your banker. It was the place to come. That changed in the late 60s and into the 70s. And by the time I started working downtown in 73, the downtown was well on its way to emptying out. Many of the larger stores, the Bon Marchés and the Pennies and the rest, had moved to the Tacoma Mall. And other smaller independent businesses either tried their luck at the mall or they just closed down. Following that, and following the fact that fewer and fewer customers meant fewer people on the street, which meant fewer customers for businesses, which also left a real void in the mid to late 70s, where frankly, gangs. There were drug gangs that had that were pretty much running as they wanted to in the downtown. Police did what they could to stop it, but they were really unable to put much of a stop to. It was a whack-a-mole game, and it was not. It was. My impression was that, and still is, that a community needs a center, a place that people believe they belongs to them. Downtown Tacoma used to be that. At this point in our lives, there was no center in Tacoma, and there was no sense of who we were. There were a number of attempts to change that. The bad experiment of the Broadway Plaza that changed major streets into a pedestrian-only thoroughfare, where in a city where somebody once pointed out, in Tacoma, if you can't drive to the bathroom, you just don't go. Had left it. It was no longer a community center by any means, nor was there a community center. There were as I said, there were a number of attempts to change that, urban renewal being a big part of it as well, and none of that really did the trick. Then came an unexpected, the idea of turning a movie theater, in particular the Roxy Theater, back into a performing arts center, which was the dream of one woman on the Tacoma Pierce County Arts Commission, Virginia Shackelford. Virginia Shackelford apparently kept trying to talk the rest of the commissioners into turning the Roxy into a performing arts center, so much that the chair of the Arts Commission said, "I don't want to hear about this anymore. You're in charge." And Virginia started to put together a really diverse group of supporters. Everyone from arts volunteers to city council members, Pete Rasmussen and Phil Schroeder in particular. She was able to to grab Norm Dix, Senator Magnuson, who were able to get federal money for this dream. And I would say that Virginia was, although she was good at bringing people together, she was an unlikely champion in that in today's world, she might not have been able to succeed. She was also well known as somebody who was conservative. Wasn't the word for it politically. She was. If you would trick or treated for UNICEF at her house, you would get a 5-minute lecture on how horrible the United Nations was. I've mentioned that only because part of her team in putting together the volunteers, the grassroots organization, was somebody else, Josephine Hyman, who was her political opposite. And together, the two of them, plus people, and there were lots of people in the middle, who climbed onto that bandwagon. In the end, her dream came alive. She convinced enough people to put their money and their time behind this project. And indeed, the city of Tacoma and the rest came back this idea. One of the things that I think should not be forgotten is, yes, we wanted a place for the performing arts. We wanted a place for the Tacoma Symphony at that time, and the Philharmonics and stage plays and everything else. We wanted that. But at the same time, the success of the Pantages led other volunteers, community activists to say, geez, maybe we could do something else here too. At the time, Union Station had been vacant for decades, was about to be torn down. And a group seeing the success of the Pantages created Save Our Station, which saved the Union Station, which became the seed, the anchor for the art museum, for the Washington State History Museum, for the University of Washington. But all of this came from the community coming together to get behind something that they thought would be a really good idea for some.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I really want people to remember that the saving of the Roxy and turning it into the Pantages really was the catalyst for everything else that followed. I mean, it was the proof that it could be done. I actually, when I was doing a little research for this program, I located somebody's doctoral dissertation that used Tacoma as a case study for how other cities could follow the model. And it was really quite sort of delightful. Let me bring in Margy now, and let's talk about kind of the partnership between corporate interests and civic interests. Tell us a little bit, what's the elevator speech about the Greater Tacoma Community Foundation as an entity and its mission, but also what you were there from the very early 80s. What was the role of the foundation in sort of all of this business?
Well, one of the benefits of a community foundation is that it's not constrained by the same rules and regulations that private foundations have, corporations have, or governmental entities have, such as the city of Tacoma. So we were brought in as an overarching, almost like an umbrella, and we worked with the city of Tacoma, particularly Ray Corpus, who gets a lot of kudos in my book for doing that, because as he was quoted as saying, if a non-governmental agency was not in charge, this theater would take 10 years to build. And he was absolutely right. And we worked with Pierce Transit. We had to buy air rights for over the park, the little park next to the theater on the square. We were the contractor of the theater on the square. The Rialto was purchased by an anonymous donor, and then was given $1.3 million to assist in its restoration. The whole campaign was $11,800,000. All the money came through the foundation, the community foundation. Many in 3-year pledges. We administered all of that. We sent out reminders. We had, I think it was less than 2% failure in those 3-year pledges, and which I think is pretty remarkable. I have a funny Rialto story. That was my real introduction to what was ahead, because it was a very steep learning curve, which I didn't realize at the beginning, but it became very obvious. I went to the Rialto with Frank Underwood, who was the president of Grantmaker Consultants, Inc., and a really futuristic thinker. And we went to see the Rialto, which was being really emptied. And one of the workmen brought us over to a column that was not holding up anything. And it was one of the balcony columns. That column was being held up by empty whiskey bottles and a toilet. That is a true story. And as I was standing there, my life kind of went in front of me, thinking, oh dear God, what have we done? And there were other surprises along the way. And Jim Merritt was the architect, and Rushworth was the contractor. And it was challenging because that theater was built on rubble from 2 previous fires. And it was an engineering feat to restore that. So it was, I had more fun than I've ever had in my life, but it's more fun looking back on it after 30 years.
Those slides look really pretty. Great.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. It's really great to get an insider and a first row seat at sort of all the machinations that go on to pull something like this off. Yeah, and so let me bring Phyllis in now, because part of recreating the theater district and making a downtown that would draw people and make it a pleasant experience was sort of the atmosphere of the larger neighborhood. And I know you, as working with the Broadway Center, had a lot to do with things like the Mask Project and things. Tell us a little bit about your work in those early days.
Sure. And Margie, I'd heard about the whiskey bottles. I hadn't heard about the toilet. But my involvement, Greg, was not nearly as extensive as anyone else here, but I was involved with what I think is just pivotal and marvelous signage, which is the masks in the theater district.
Yes.
When I came on board, and I was on staff at the Broadway Center at the time, the Mask project was underway. I think it was the brainchild of Frank Underwood, and then working also with Judith Stone McLaren, Nyland at Stone McLaren,
Yeah.
and
Doug
artist
Granum.
Doug Granum.
Yeah.
The notion being all cultures, almost all cultures, use some form of masks in dramatic presentations. And so this would be a way to really signify that this theater district belongs to the community, the
Yep.
whole community. And I wish we had known then that in addition to dancing people in the Broadway Center logo, the same facility would be hosting, and I'm drawing a blank on it, not ukulele. Yes, ukulele
Yes,
lessons.
slack
Ukulele,
guitar,
yeah.
yes.
And
Slack keeps it.
but at any rate, what we were able to do initially, the notion was to research various cultural mask traditions in various cultures. And with my particular background, what I was able to do was open up the doors to bring community members from those cultural communities into the whole process. So that when you see the masks that are up and down Broadway, those did not come out of a library book. They came from the community, from people talking about their traditions and how they wanted them represented. So it's a very live, very engaging statement and a very real representation of the desire to make a theater district that really does belong to the entire community. And I have to back up for just a minute and say that Steph left out one of my favorite Steph recollections about the launching of the Pantages, which was one of the things Virginia Shackelford did was gather together literally 7 ladies with brooms to sweep the dust and pigeon poop and whatever off the stage and invite various civic city folks in to take a look. And that was really where it all got started. So, yeah.
I remember Steph telling stories about the ladies with the brooms also. And that's I'm glad you brought that up, because that reminds us that sometimes it boils down to a few people doing some really basic things to get something going. You know, we sort of get caught up in the big picture, but I mean, sometimes it's those early details that are critical.
Yeah.
Greg, just to tie on to something Phyllis said, brought up, and Margy as well, that the mask project was the Theater District Task Force is the group that led the campaign for making a theater district.
Yep.
Now it could have been a group that just said, we're going to build a new building and we're going to fix up a couple of old buildings.
Yep.
Instead, it was intentional. I think Margy, you and Frank Underwood particularly were intent on making this a community site. And that's what Frank had said particularly, I don't want to leave this just building 4 walls of buildings. We want to fill up the streets with people. Yeah. And that's where the mask project fit in. That's why this same Theater District Task Force brought in, among other things, it brought in First Night.
Yep.
Way for the community to come to its place and to celebrate as a community. It was intentional. It did not just happen.
And it has resulted in things like the farmers market, which still is functioning in that very inviting space.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Let me turn now to our musicians. Let's bring up Lisa Ingraham, and I want to chat about what it's like to play in the Pantages and the Rialto Theaters. You're a violinist. You've played both with the orchestra and the opera. Tell us a little bit about your memories of playing in the early Pantages, and I suppose even up until the present day.
Well, coming into the Pantages, especially after coming out of venues like Wilson High School or the Temple Theater, is a special event. You know, it coming into that theater showed the value that was placed on the performers, on the performances, and on the audience. one of the things that I often tell my students is that people hear with their eyes, and what they see affects their perception of what they hear. And so when you walk into the theater, it says excellence, that what is going to happen in that space is something special. We're setting the table for our guests, and for a musician walking in there, it's exciting to walk into a space that is, the upkeep is there, and it's clean, and it's all those things. For my kids, any event that they went to at the Pantages was a very special thing. I remember very well. In fact, it's some of my kids' favorite memories is going there to see the Tacoma Youth Symphony do Peter and the Wolf, back when they would do on Thanksgiving weekend with the Magic Circle Mime Company, to go through that. And it was a dress-up affair. And so, right now we're kind of going through things at my parents' house, and there's a recording of Peter and the Wolf. And my kids and a couple of the other grandkids who would do that yearly all want that record. That's part of their special memories. Going to the opera for student night, again, very special. Sometimes the girls would bring a friend with them, and it was a dress-up affair, and out came the tiaras. They knew that it was going to be a special thing. So, being part of those theaters, looking at the ceiling, when we do education concerts, I see these kids coming in, and they are in awe of the space, and they know that, this could be a place that they will never see again. It's probably, unlike for many of them, something they have ever seen. They've never seen a live performance, let alone a live orchestra. And I see them staring at that ceiling, just in awe of that space. And again, it speaks to the value that is placed on what we're doing and what we're presenting. So, that's really a key thing, and playing in the Pantages, it's completely different from the Rialto. It's a different type of space. The Rialto acoustics are incredibly lovely, but it's a much more intimate setting because the stage almost goes into the audience. In the Pantages, it's a much grander space, and it's wonderful to play in. It's a little drier, but once we added the new shell, it made a huge difference in what we're able to do. But again, the space is fabulous. Just to be able to be, and it's so wonderful to be able to be there again. But as you said earlier, my experience is not just on stage, it's also under the stage. Right? So for the opera, the original pit that was in the Pantages was very small. And so the shows that they were able to put on all depended on, orchestrations that could fit the number of people that they needed in that pit. And it was 20-ish, maybe as many as 24, but it was pretty small. And so the first renovation that happened to the pit, they took out the bullpen that was outside of the orchestra pit and incorporated that into the pit space. But that also meant that the pit descended all the way to the basement floor. So we have a very unique pit. Most of the time, orchestra pits are just flat. And in our orchestra pit, it descends in tiers into the bowels of the theater, dropping 18 inches all the way back. And so it's just the first rehearsal in there, even when you have played it many times, takes a little bit just to get yourself acclimated to looking up to see the conductor, adjusting your stand, getting the person in front of you to move their chair so that you're not looking through their head, or, just to get the logistics in place. But it is an incredibly unique space, but it works. And so that opened doors for the opera to do much larger productions. In fact, I think that the first one that we did in that expanded space had over 50 orchestra members, if I remember correctly. It was quite large. When they renovated the pit the second time, adding the hydraulic lift that now can lift and lower that front section, makes it getting a piano on and off the stage so much easier. The hydraulic mechanisms took some of the space from the musicians, but at the same time, we can still fit quite a large orchestra down there. But it's a very unique space. In the Rialto, it's quite a bit different. There is no orchestra pit. And so the first show I ever played there with the opera was Amal and the Night Visitors, and somehow they had us in a side aisle. I still can't remember exactly how but I remember we were in the side aisle on the right side of the auditorium. In the last few years, as we've done things we've actually created an orchestra pit, but there were times when we would have stuff, orchestra behind the curtain or in front of the curtain at the back of the stage. Sometimes there was times that it was off to the side of the stage, really small ensemble. I remember being in one of those one time, and I was getting over a cold, and of course I had to cough in the middle of a recitative, and so the entire audience is now coughing because one person. Para's suggestion is great, but we created a pit. They take out several rows of seats, and the first couple years we did that, of course, we're dealing with the slope, and we had a little accident one time when you're dealing with music stands and a sloping floor. Unfortunately, one tipped over because the feet weren't quite well. It landed on a cello. Oh. And it was not a pretty thing, but fortunately it was insured and taken care of. But after that, we created a level space for the orchestra, for the strings to sit on, and then the winds and brass and percussion is still on the floor right next to the stage. But that's what ends up happening in the Rialto. Yeah. Theater on the Square, the opera hasn't done too many productions there, but we have performed there. And that is a tiny pit. We're back to the same problem with the Pantages, but it's also a very small theater. And so, again, you have to be careful what you do there, but you can certainly do productions there. But it is very small, and there's some back doors at the back that open up so they can load things in and out, but they will also put some platforms back there. So you can put a couple extra people a little behind there. But that's the way orchestra pits are in those theaters. They're all lovely to work in for various reasons. They're all different. But it's exciting to have these beautiful venues to be able to go into and to work as a musician, and, for organizations, not only like the Symphony and the opera, who is doing something in Urban Grace this spring. New situation, new venue, small orchestra for this one. But as we're coming out of the pandemic, we make things work as best we can, and we're all going to come out of this.
It's great to hear, again, granular details from the musician's point of view.
Oh, it gets interesting because it's always cozy. And I have to say, huge props to the backstage crew at all of these theaters, because I work with them on a really close basis as my role as orchestra manager with the opera. And they are amazing.
Yeah, indeed. I second that. Let's bring in Dr. Paul Cobbs now and get the point of view of a conductor. Paul, you've conducted all over the world. You've conducted in some very fine venues. And of course, you've conducted in most, if not all, of the venues we talked about tonight here in the Restored Theater District. Of course, the Youth Symphony is primarily a tenant of the Rialto. Go ahead and just, from the conductor's point of view, tell us a little bit about conducting either in the Rialto or the Pantages, the difference that you see as a conductor.
Yes, well, the nice thing is that we've been able to perform in the Pantages, the Rialto, Theater on the Square, and Urban Grace. So we know all of those venues. I laughed when Lisa talked about Peter and the Wolf, because I remember conducting Peter and the Wolf, but what she didn't tell you was that we performed with the Magic Circle Mime. And as a conductor, I had to act as well. So I had acting lessons. It was the first time I was ever booed because I was the grandfather. Everyone loved Peter. And because I was the mean old grandfather, all the little kids booed me after the performance. So I thought I was very credible. So the thing about the Pantages, it's absolutely gorgeous. I've seen theaters all over the world, and that's a very nice theater. What I've learned to do is when we are performing in the Pantages, at the first rehearsal, for the 10 minutes of the first rehearsal, I'll say, okay, just look, because the theater is far more interesting than I am at the very beginning of the rehearsal. So I allow the students to just look, and they're amazed. It's beautiful. More recently, though, we did Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with PLU choirs, and that was fantastic. That was a celebration of our 50th anniversary. What's difficult about the Pantages, though, is that it's not very forgiving. You have to really work hard to get that full, rich sound that you're used to. So by the end of the concert, we were all extremely tired because strings have to dig in more, winds have to project more. It's hard, but you can do it. It just takes more energy. Rialto, on the other hand, is very friendly, especially for the strings. The strings sing in the Rialto. It's also, as Lisa said, it's such that you're looking at the audience. They're right on top of you. And so this is a wonderful place to play when you want to invite your friends and your family. They're right there. And so it's a smaller auditorium. It doesn't hold as many people, but the sound is gorgeous. It's very friendly sound-wise. We used the Rialto to do a dress rehearsal for every tour that we've taken. We've been to New York twice and played in Carnegie Hall. We played in Boston Symphony Hall. We played in the Cathedral at Washington, D.C., and at the Colburn School in L.A. And so we used the Rialto as a kind of a warm-up to take the show on the road. It's nice because all the families can come and listen. We sound really good, but on the other hand, we can take it back, and the little mistakes that happen, we can fix. So we really enjoy the Rialto. Just a few days ago, on the 30th of October, we did a concert of film music. We call it a costume concert, where everybody dresses up and we play music from the films like Star Wars and Avengers and things like that. And because of COVID, we're spread out, but the sound was just fantastic. It was like a surround sound. The fact that we took out all the chairs in the front of the audience and spread the orchestra out, and the sound was wonderful. It just reverberated all through the church, and all of the audience members said it's just like surround sound. So that was great. We've even been to the theater on the square. That is a very small place to play. We did Damn Yankees. We did a musical. So that was their first experience doing a musical. And that was fun, but we were like little sardines. I'm very impressed with the theaters that Tacoma has, because not every city has a choice. And you can choose. They're all different. They all have different personalities, whether it's the Pantages, Rialto, Urban Grace, or Theater on the Square. They're all different. They all have their perks and they all have their drawbacks too. But I think in the end, we're very happy to have the opportunity to have such nice venues to perform in.
Well, thank you very much. Let's bring everybody back up just in the last couple of minutes here. And sort of think about where we've been. I mean, looking at some slides of the actual restoration process and the history from where we came. And then, you know, 3 of the serious movers and shakers of this whole thing right here on the panel with us. And then 2 musicians, performer and conductor, representing at least 3 of the major classical music tenants of these theaters. It's just really, I don't know, I just feel sort of proud, I guess, you know, that this is a city that could somehow pull that off. And as Steph pointed out, the theaters were what led the way. And now we have a branch campus of the University of Washington. We have this phenomenal Union Station connected to a federal courthouse. We have farmers markets, you know, the downtown has become lively. Even McMenamins, I mean, you know, it's likely they wouldn't have looked at Tacoma if they didn't see a city on the move, you know, and so it just continues on. And now, of course, most recently, the Armory is sort of on the books as a venue space, and we're all eager to see what may happen there. Paul mentioned Urban Grace as a place where lots of things go on, including lots of youth symphony concerts. Any final thoughts from anybody that we should close with?
Well, I'm never one not to speak. When you talk, when the Pantages was coming online, people had no idea what would go. I mean, people had their dreams. We don't want to go to a high school auditorium anymore to hear good music, or to see a play. But nobody really knew what would be happening there. The plans, actually, the business plan for the Pantages was altogether wrong. But as you do in the arts, you learn to improvise. And you learn to make corrections. Your youth symphony, Paul, nobody really, at least I never thought that you would go from a couple youth symphonies to 7 of them right after they moved to the Rialto.
Yes.
I think the same thing may well happen with the Armory. I have no idea what they can do with that space. I know that there are talented people who will turn that into another valuable space for the community.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You know, just I want to remind people, if you're interested in these stories, this history, of course, one of the places you can always go are to the books of Murray Morgan. This one, Puget Sound, is specifically his history of the city of Tacoma, full of facts, and he's just a terrific writer as well as historian. You may remember from our last episode, this book, Safarian, put together by Jan Safarian, his wife, all kinds of clippings and articles about Ed Safarian and Jan and their work putting Symphony Tacoma together. And then finally, this wonderful book, which is the most recent of them, put together by Blaine Johnson and Brian Kamens, and really a history of theaters in Tacoma. And I know I'm a nerd, but this was an absolute page turner to me. I remember sitting up late at night reading this book, just being utterly enthralled by these stories and these photos. So I recommend all those to anybody who wants to know more about all of this. Let me just close by reminding people that next Wednesday evening, November 10, we have our next pre-concert mixer. It's online for Symphony Tacoma. And we will be interviewing Joshua Thompson, who's a musical sociologist, and talking about Black composers, particularly Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges, whose second symphony, the symphony we'll be playing, on November 20. So that is another date to keep in mind, Saturday, November 20. And finally, let me just, as always, thank our sponsors who support the season of Symphony Tacoma, and in doing so, all of these sort of peripheral events. I want to thank Multicare and Tacoma Creates, without whose support none of this could happen. So let me just thank my guests one more time. I'm just thrilled to have you here. Paul Cobbs, Lisa Ingraham, Margy McGroarty, Steph Farber, and Phyllis Harrison. What a delight it has been to hear your personal stories about this wonderful history, and without which everything that Symphony Tacoma, Tacoma Youth Symphony, the Northwest Sinfonietta, Tacoma Opera, all of these things could not possibly have happened without this pivotal moment where the city decided to save its downtown and to start with performing arts venues. Pretty
Thank
exciting.
you.
And as
Thank you. It was fun.
yeah, as I say, it's being studied around the nation as a model to follow. So let's be proud of that. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Hope to see you soon
Bye-bye.
at one of these theaters.
Bye.
Bye-bye.